Welcome back everyone to another part of the composition series. Today we're going to talk about polychords. Again, all the media I'm going to be showing will be up on Buy Me a Coffee. I also recently added a composer contract template with explanations on there as well, so go check it out. Now let's dive right into it. What are polychords? Well, it's two or more unrelated chords stacked on top of each other. That's it. It's that simple. It can be done with simple triads, it can be done with extended chords that have more than 3 different notes. It works in any inversion of the chords with major, minor, diminished, augmented, doesn't matter. Polychords are part of what we call bitonality or polytonality, which is basically when a whole piece or a portion of a piece is played in more than one key simultaneously. Be careful about the notation. Polychords are notated with a horizontal line. So you have the top chord symbol written on the top, then a horizontal line, and the bottom chord symbol written below it. It's not a slash, like a sideways slash. That just indicates that the top chord symbol is the chord, and then the bottom symbol is just the bass note. It's not a separate chord. So be mindful of that. Now, the color that those chords produce is very dependent on how related the chords are. Because technically, you can keep stacking chords in thirds and just keep them in the same tonality, in which case you don't necessarily have to interpret it as bitonality. You could also just say they are extended chords of the same root. So if they're very related, you might even interpret them as one chord with jazz chord extensions basically on top. Then there are polychords that share some chord tones. We're going to see some examples of that. One of them is, for example, C major on A major. They share an E. And then you have polychords that share absolutely no notes in common. We're going to see some examples of that as well. It's, actually the first one we're going to show is C major on D flat major. They have nothing in common. They're literally a half step apart. Generally, you can keep in mind that the fewer chord tones they have in common, the more tense it's going to sound, because you get a lot more dissonances and, you're getting closer and closer to really just have clusters and not tonality anymore. But then again, how dissonant it sounds is also determined by voicing and orchestration. A close voicing is going to create a lot more tension and a lot more dissonance, a lot more, clashing notes, whereas a pulled apart voicing is going to sound much less dissonant and it's going to, in most contexts make more sense. So it really depends on where you place the dissonances and the clashing notes. If they're far enough apart, it doesn't sound as clashing. And it also kind of depends on, what the top line is, what the bottom line is. Are those clashing? Are they not clashing? So voicing is very important in this technique. And it also greatly matters how you orchestrate it. Usually, if you separate the different harmonies by register or by colors, orchestral colors, you can get away with a lot of things. Polychords usually sound a lot harsher if they're kept in the same color, like just on the piano. But the moment you pull them apart and adjust the voicing and then also start to use the orchestral colors as textures, it's starting to make a lot more sense in a way. And it usually also sounds a little more interesting. It also depends on, whether one of the chords is arpeggiated or both of them are arpeggiated or if it's just sustains. It just creates very different vibes depending on how you voice it, how you orchestrate it, what colors you're using, and how you're using those colors. Like, again, something that might sound incredibly dissonant on the piano might sound fantastic in the orchestra using different colors. Or something that sounds really harsh in close voicing on the piano might sound really great in the brass, for example. So yeah, it really depends. Like, here are some examples of different voicings. Like I'm gonna go from close to wide voicings just in the piano, just so you can see what I mean. So this one is going to be C major on D flat major. So this is the closest voicing, where you can see you have basically the chords right next to each other and they're just clashing in minor seconds. And then with every iteration, I pull it apart further so you can see what that does and what that sounds like. Let's play it. Right? It's a very different vibe from here to here. So let's look at a couple of orchestral examples from film music, because the question, of course, with all of these is, I'm a film composer, so how is this useful to me when I actually write a film score? Where can I use this in my job? The most common uses you'll find are either in jazz or mystery, science fiction, and you'll see in a second why that is. So let's get into it. So this first example is from Star Wars. Let's listen to it so you know exactly which one I mean. These are the chords that play right after the main title card is done, and it's basically the transition into the actual movie. So let's take a listen to that. Instant science fiction feel, partially because we all know Star Wars, and Star Wars is based on the planets, which were written before John Williams was born, by the way. A lot of people, whenever they hear this kind of thing, they're like, oh, it's John Williams. This technique was popular, I think it was at peak popularity before he was born. Obviously, he grew up with this kind of music, but he didn't invent this. This was a thing before he entered this planet. So if you want to see more of this kind of stuff, I'd urge you to listen to The Planets, actually, by Holst, where you will find a lot of this stuff, because it was just popular at the time. But so if you look at the markers, this is C major on D flat major, C major on A major, C major on E major. Let's see how this is orchestrated. It's basically separated by registers. So if you look at the strings, you can see that the upper strings, the violins, are playing the C major chord, and then the lower strings, the bass, cello, and violas are playing the lower chord in arpeggios. Disregard the mock-up. It's the best I could do quickly. This is doubled by harp and by celeste, as far as I could see or hear. But then you have the high woodwinds play, it's the same separation, except these are actually playing sustains. So it's basically a separation of textures here as well. But so the high woodwinds are playing C major, and then the low woodwinds are playing the lower chord. Also, the high chord, as you can see, is staying static here. It's all, the top stays C major all throughout, whereas the lower chords are changing. So at no point do the chords overlap each other, and they're always at least a third apart in the middle. And then we have the brass. This is where some overlaps are happening, I believe, in the trumpets. But you can see still that there's space in between. There you go. That's the whole magic of it. You can also see that he starts out, the most dissonant C on D flat is, they have nothing in common. Then C on A, those are mediant related chords. And they have a chord tone in common, namely the E. And then C on E, also mediant chord relation. This could almost be one chord if you're looking at it from a jazz perspective, because the B is actually a major 7 in C major, and the G sharp from the E, if you interpret that as an A flat, would be a flat 13 in C. So this is almost so related that it could be one chord. So he basically goes from incredibly dissonant to sort of related by one note to very related, and then separates the colors with textures and by register. Now let's look at another example. This one is from one of my scores from Four Enchanted Sisters. This is the library cue. It's a mystery cue, basically. So let's listen to that one. So the way this was orchestrated is, you can see in the markers again what the chords are. It's A minor on D flat minor, D flat major on D minor, E minor on F minor, C major on F minor, and then some planing here that I just wanted to point out. So the top 3 notes played by the violins are the top chord, and the bottom notes are the bottom chord, this played by bass, cello, and violas. And also some little perk that I put in here is the top is moving down, the bottom is moving up, which you can freely do because it's polytonality, so nothing has to be related to anything. But that was kind of the idea. The top moves down, the bottom moves up. In a way, this is all planing. These are basically planing up as far as I can see. These are planing down. So you can also combine polytonality with planing, with pedal tones, with pretty much anything that I've already talked about. But so this is what the strings sound like by themselves. And the interesting thing is, if you put it this far apart, it really doesn't sound that dissonant, even though a lot of these chords have nothing in common. But it just strangely sounds very consonant, even though it's different keys going on at the same time. I mean, just looking at this first chord, for example, the only thing they have in common is the E, but you have an A and an A flat, that's a minor second, that's clashing technically, and you have a C and a C sharp, or D flat, which is also a minor second, that should be clashing. But since it's so far apart, it kind of works. So this is something really fun to play around with, especially when using orchestral colors. I have a cue coming up that is literally the opposite, where I did really close voicing, and you're going to be able to hear the difference. And then I just doubled this with choir, partially, harp, celeste, vibraphone, and triangles. And the horns and the woodwinds are just doing their planing thing at the end. This kind of has nothing to do with polytonality. It was just something that I thought would be fun to showcase as well, considering we've already talked about planing. This cue obviously goes further. You can hear it on the soundtrack album. I think it's called At the Library or something. But that's that. Now the next bit is something I've used in the Jade Pendant, but I think I've also used something very similar in Help I Shrunk My Parents? ? It's again kind of a mysterious, creepy cue, but this time it's much more confusing because it's not entirely clear what the harmonies are. And also it's much closer voicing, so it's much more dissonant to the point where it's almost more like clusters. I don't fully remember what I did because this was like in 2017, so whatever I was thinking. I do remember it was polytonality that I was thinking, so here we go. This is what that sounds like. Do I fully know what's going on here? No, I do not, but it's okay. So we got strings, celeste, and woodwinds going on. And so this is where it gets a little confusing. So the way I constructed this, that part I remember, is I always start on one chord first for 2 beats, and then the polytonality happens. So it feels more rooted. But as you can see, there's a lot of close voicing. I didn't pull this one apart. This one was supposed to be tense and, uncomfortable. And so I chose these intervals. But so what we have here is we start with C major 7. So we start with C major with a major 7 on it. And then we have that same chord continuing on E flat. You can see the E flat down here, and the G we got up here, right? So that's the first one. And somehow I felt this needed to resolve to this one, but I don't even know what this one is, because this could be interpreted as G major on E flat, right? We have these notes, D, B, and G. That would be G major. And we have all the notes for E flat major as well. E flat, G, and B flat. But that doesn't quite make sense with what's in the bass, because we have the B in the bass. So what makes a lot more sense is to think maybe at the top we have G minor. So G, B flat, D, on an augmented B chord. But I don't know. I mean, it's almost a cluster, basically, so no idea. Maybe there's a different way to interpret this as well, but who knows? If there was an F sharp in here, I would have said it's B major, but there is none. So I don't know what I was thinking. But so this is that chord. Then we do the same thing again where we start with A minor, just plain A minor, and then the polychord comes in. And this one is another one that you could interpret in so many different ways. It could be A major on A flat major, or A minor on E flat 7 sus4, or D flat minor on A diminished. I'm sure there's even more ways to interpret this, but there's so many chords you could build out of this. And I mean, considering the bass note is A flat, A major on A flat kind of makes the most sense, but it makes less sense because I'm starting out with A minor, so who knows? Anyway, this is what that sounds like. And so this one is not a polychord anymore. This is just F sharp major with a flat 13, or an add sharp 5 if you want to see it that way. Harmony. And then the flat 13 resolves though into just a regular F sharp. And then since we already talked about medians, I wanted to showcase this as well, because we go from F sharp major to D minor, which is a median to F sharp. And then we go from D minor to B flat minor, which is also a median to the previous one. B flat minor is a median to D minor. So you can actually see this in action as well here. All right, this one is just very confusing to me because I don't really remember what my thought process was. But this is what it is. You can find that, I think, both on the Jade Pendant soundtrack at some point, but also on Help I Shrunk My Parents. And then I have two more cues that are from Fearless. Because science fiction, and this always works with science fiction. So this is, let's start with this one. So for this one, I have these high alternating notes going on, which are the top chord. In this case, it's just a static A flat major. And then it turns into A flat augmented. So that's what this sounds like. Sounds like a song by ABBA, doesn't it? I don't remember which one. I used to listen to a lot of ABBA when I was young. This is doubled by harmonics. Right? So we have the top chord in the high register. And so you have the brass and the strings play the chords. Again, I did the John Williams technique where I have the high strings and the higher brass play the top harmony, and then the low brass and low strings play the lower harmony. It sounds like this. Now, I chose some things, I made some different choices that John Williams didn't make in the example that I showed before, which is I put this clashing note here in the horns because I think it works pretty well. Generally in brass, a lot of things work that wouldn't work in other instruments. And I also have this clashing note right here where basically the low chord and the higher harmony are meeting in the middle. Also a choice that, you know, I thought it worked, so I did it, but that would warrant some consideration. That could also very well not have worked. And then I have the celeste actually just play out the chords like this. Right? It's A flat, A flat, A flat, F, A flat, and then the augmented. But that's the whole secret to this one. And then I used polychords again in Fearless. This time it sounds like this. Right? Also very science fiction-y. This is when they like exit the spaceship. And kind of a similar technique where, let's look at the strings. You have a consistent high chord going on, namely C major, which is just sustained by the violins. And then the lower strings are playing the lower chords, in this case D flat major, A flat major. So it sounds like this. And then we have the brass, and the brass is only playing the lower chords. So in this cue, I actually did a color separation where only the high strings are playing the, polytonality, and everyone else is playing the lower chords that are moving under that sustained polychord pedal, I guess you could call it. And this, by the way, is also planing, where the lower chord goes from A to A flat. It's all over the place. I mean, planing lends itself really nicely to polytonality, or vice versa. So that's also happening here. We got some extra like vibraphone and choir and stuff going on, but they're just doubling up on those harmonies. But the interesting thing happens here in the woodwinds. So when they come in later, they play first the C chord that is only in the high strings at this point, but they're also then jumping into D major, again, planing. But more importantly, this now creates, I guess it would be called tritonality, because now we have C major in the high strings, A flat major in low strings and brass, but then we have D major in the woodwinds. So we now have 3 different harmonies going on at the same time. Right? It's right here. So let's play through this one last time. So in this example, you can see pretty well how we're separating by colors. And then apparently you can even have 3 different harmonies and it's fine. It doesn't sound off-putting at all. But yeah, you do get that science fiction-y feel to it. Now, as I've already pointed out, you can combine this with planing, you can combine this with median chords, you can combine this with pedal tones, anything we've already talked about. And I feel like this is maybe where you can start to see why it's so hard to talk about composition techniques, because most of them aren't isolated. They are combinations of multiple things going on. And just imagine knowing even just 20 different composition techniques, just how many combinations there are. Like if you have 20 techniques that can all be combined in numerous ways, you already have like 1 million possibilities or something. So very difficult topic to talk about. And also that's why it's very difficult for anyone to write books about this, because usually techniques are not isolated little things. They're a combination of a variety of things. It's just not as simple as, oh, hey, can you make a quick list of composition techniques? Or, why isn't there a book listing all of them? It's not really possible mathematically to do that. If you want to look at other examples, I've already mentioned the planets. You can also look at Stravinsky, specifically the Rite of Spring, uses a lot of polytonality. You got John Williams, Star Wars obviously, but I think he also uses a lot of this in Close Encounters of the Third Kind, E.T., basically every time when there's aliens. I bet, I haven't listened to the soundtrack in a while, but I bet you can also find this in War of the Worlds. It would be surprising if not. But so this is maybe also where you understand why I think understanding musical language is important, or where knowing technique is important. It doesn't matter where you get that information from, but having that knowledge is important, because just with the 4 videos that I've done so far, you could pretty much score a lot of film scenes without having to be inspired. And that's really the point of knowing technique, to know the craftsmanship of something, so that you can still do it even when you're not feeling inspired or when your creative energy is drained, especially at the end of a project. This is where I just tap into this kind of stuff and I'm like, okay, well, I can still do this and not be inspired at all and still get the job done. Because when you make this your job, you're not going to be inspired every day. You're going to have to still deliver on a deadline, and it is what it is. And technique is then what helps you get through it. You can still fall back on this and then just get the job done in a crafty, professional manner, which is, what we do 90% of the time anyway. I hope this was helpful. Again, the media is on Buy Me a Coffee, and have fun and,